It is a matter of historical record that some crimes are so deeply unnatural that they permanently alter the psyche of the investigators who uncover them. In the late autumn of 1979, across the sun-drenched landscape of Southern California, an invisible predator began stalking the suburbs, leaving behind absolutely no clues, no witnesses, and no demands. Teenage girls were vanishing into thin air, seemingly swallowed by the daylight, right from their own neighborhoods. Families were left staring at empty bedrooms, waiting for phone calls that would never come, while local police departments struggled to find a single thread connecting the missing youth. The air in Los Angeles County grew thick with an unspoken, paralyzing dread as the realization set in that someone or something was hunting. But nobody could have possibly predicted that the source of this nightmare was a standard, ordinary silver GMC van cruising down the highway.
Inside that silver van sat two men who appeared entirely unremarkable to the casual observer, the kind of ordinary citizens you would pass on the street without a second thought. Lawrence Bittaker and Roy Norris were ordinary ex-convicts who had formed a deeply twisted bond while serving time together in a California state prison. To the outside world, they were just two blue-collar guys trying to reintegrate into society, often seen carrying a heavy, metallic craftsman's toolbox to various odd jobs. However, this ordinary toolbox did not contain the standard instruments for innocent manual labor or home repair. Instead, it was meticulously packed with heavy pliers, vice grips, wire cutters, and ice picks, tools repurposed for an unspeakable, deeply sinister hidden agenda. They drove through the suburban streets like patient vultures, scanning the sidewalks for vulnerable targets, waiting for the perfect opportunity to strike.
Their opportunity finally materialized on a quiet evening when they spotted 16-year-old Lucinda Schaefer walking alone along a peaceful tree-lined street. Pulling up to the curb with practiced ease, the two men rolled down the window and offered her a completely innocent ride home, projecting an aura of safety. Trusting her instinct in the suburban quiet, the young girl stepped into the vehicle, completely unaware that she had just crossed an invisible threshold into absolute darkness. The moment the side door slid shut with a heavy metallic thud, the friendly facade instantly vanished, replaced by pure, unadulterated malice. Before she could even process the sudden shift in reality, she was violently overpowered, bound securely, and hidden from view as the van sped away. The vehicle blended seamlessly into the evening traffic, carrying its helpless passenger toward a remote, isolated location hidden deep within the desolate San Gabriel Mountains.
High up in the rugged, pitch-black canyons, far beyond the reach of any human help, the two men unleashed a level of cruelty that defied human comprehension. For hours, the quiet mountain air was pierced by a terror so profound that it would later haunt the dreams of seasoned detectives for decades. They utilized the ordinary contents of their heavy toolbox to inflict calculated, systematic agony, transforming everyday hardware into instruments of pure, unmitigated torture. But the absolute worst part of this scenario was not just the physical brutality occurring in the dark. It was a small battery-operated tape recorder sitting on the dashboard. The tape reels were actively spinning, capturing every single agonizing second of the victim's final moments on Earth in crystal-clear audio. When the morning sun finally rose, the van descended the mountain alone, leaving behind a mystery that would remain buried in the dirt for months. For months, the San Gabriel Mountains held their grim secrets in absolute silence, while the silver van continued to cruise the California highways completely unnoticed. The disappearance of Lucinda Schaefer had sent shockwaves through the community, but with no crime scene and no physical evidence, the investigation quickly stalled out. Lawrence Bittaker and Roy Norris walked among the public as free men, emboldened by how incredibly easy it had been to vanish a human being.
They realized that the vast, rugged wilderness surrounding Los Angeles provided the perfect camouflage for their dark impulses, acting as a massive, silent graveyard. The ordinary toolbox sat on the floorboards of the vehicle, freshly cleaned and ready, its metallic latches gleaming in the bright California sun. The predators had tasted absolute control, and it wouldn't be long before their insatiable hunger drove them back to the asphalt to hunt again.
It was not a matter of if they would strike again, but precisely when, and their dark desires manifested on another unsuspecting teenager. Jackie Gilliam, just 16 years old, was walking along a sidewalk when the familiar silver GMC van pulled up smoothly beside her. Using the exact same practiced charm and disarming demeanor, the two men managed to lure her close enough to the vehicle to strike. In a flash of brutal, coordinated violence, Jackie was pulled into the darkness of the van before she could even scream for help. The door slammed shut, signaling the start of another horrific journey up into the winding, isolated mountain roads. As the city lights faded into the distance behind them, the absolute terror of her situation became agonizingly clear to the young girl. She was entirely alone in the dark with two monsters, and the nightmare was resetting.
Deep, resonant narrator of mysteries. Deep within the isolated canyons, the predators initiated their horrific routine once more, transforming the serene mountain night into a theater of pure psychological and physical torment. They opened the heavy craftsman's toolbox, selecting their instruments with a cold, calculated precision that resembled a twisted surgical procedure rather than a random act of violence. Every scream, every desperate plea for mercy, and every breathless gasp from the victim was met with total, chilling indifference from her captors. Once again, the small, battery-operated tape recorder sat on the console, its plastic gears turning slowly, preserving the auditory reality of human suffering. Bittaker and Norris took a sick, twisted pride in documenting their crimes, treating the audio recordings as personal trophies to be savored later. They believed they were completely invincible, operating in a lawless void where the screams of their victims simply dissolved into the vast, empty night air below. But the darkness they were generating could not remain contained forever, and their terrifying spree was rapidly escalating toward a breaking point. Following the murder of Jackie Gilliam, the killers grew even bolder, discarding all remaining caution as they hunted for more victims to satisfy their twisted urges. Within a shockingly short span of time, 3 more young women, Jacqueline Lamp, Andrea Hall, and Shirley Ledford, would vanish into the predatory grasp of the silver van. The pattern was horrifyingly consistent, a relentless cycle of abduction, mountain torture, and systematic disposal that baffled law enforcement at every single turn. Yet with every subsequent crime, the killers were leaving behind an invisible trail of psychological devastation and physical debris that would eventually catch up to them. They had no idea that a single microscopic mistake was about to expose the contents of their toolbox to the light of day.
The unbroken streak of terrifying luck that had protected Lawrence Bittaker and Roy Norris finally began to fracture due to a separate, unrelated crime. Roy Norris, emboldened by a false sense of absolute invincibility, committed a brutal assault on a woman who, against all odds, managed to survive the encounter. Unlike the teenage girls who vanished into the mountains, this survivor went straight to the police, providing a detailed description of her attacker. Armed with this critical breakthrough, detectives moved in quickly, arresting Norris on a quiet afternoon and bringing him into a cold interrogation room. At first, detectives believed they were dealing with a standard, isolated assault case, completely unaware of the mountain graveyard.
But as the intense pressure of the interrogation mounted, Norris's stoic psychological facade began to violently crack. Desperate to avoid the death penalty, he leaned forward and whispered a confession that completely recontextualized every missing person case in California.
The seasoned investigators in the room listened in stunned, horrified silence as Norris began to systematically detail the dark exploits of the silver van. He laid out the entire timeline, naming Lawrence Bittaker as the mastermind and exposing the exact locations where they had hidden their victims. Police departments across the state were instantly mobilized, dispatching heavily equipped forensic teams directly into the rugged, desolate terrain of the San Gabriel Mountains. Digging through the loose dirt and remote brush, recovery teams slowly unearthed the tragic, skeletal remains of the missing teenage girls. The grim discoveries sent a massive shockwave of profound grief and absolute fury through the surrounding suburban communities. But as the physical evidence began to pile up at headquarters, Norris revealed one final, devastating detail that made the detectives' blood run cold. He told them about the small tape recorder and the hidden evidence locker where the tapes were kept.
Acting on the emergency tip, a heavily armed tactical unit swarmed Lawrence Bittaker's residence, arresting him without incident before he could destroy any evidence. Investigators immediately began a meticulous, top-to-bottom search of the property, hunting for the specific trophies Norris had described during his confession. Tucked away in a dark, dusty closet, they located the heavy metallic craftsman's toolbox, its latches covered in a thin layer of grime. But sitting right next to the toolbox was something far more sinister: a cardboard box containing a collection of standard cassette tapes. Each cassette was carefully labeled with handwritten dates and initials, organized with the terrifying precision of a professional archivist. The lead detective picked up one of the small plastic tapes, realizing he was holding the literal audio documentation of human slaughter. The physical proof was officially in their hands, but nobody was truly prepared for the psychological toll of playing them.
The tapes were immediately rushed to a secure, soundproof forensics laboratory located deep within the basement of the police headquarters for official playback. A small group of hardened homicide detectives, federal prosecutors, and audio technicians gathered around a standard cassette deck, preparing to listen. The room was completely silent as the technician pressed the heavy play button, and the plastic reels began to spin with a faint click. Initially, there was only a low, rhythmic hiss of background static filling the quiet room, building an agonizing layer of tension. Then, a sudden, piercing sound tore through the speakers, shattering the professional composure of every single law enforcement officer present. It was a human voice, completely distorted by an unimaginable degree of terror and agonizing physical pain, pleading desperately for mercy. The true, unvarnished reality of the Toolbox Killers was echoing through the room, and it was far worse than anyone imagined.
The audio recording echoing through the forensic lab was so overwhelmingly disturbing that several seasoned detectives had to physically walk out of the room to vomit. What they were hearing was the final, agonizing hour of 16-year-old Shirley Ledford, captured with a crystal-clear, terrifying fidelity. On the tape, Lawrence Bittaker's voice sounded chillingly calm, completely detached and casual, as if he were working on a mundane carpentry project. He could be heard actively instructing Roy Norris on which specific hardware tool to retrieve from the craftsman's toolbox next. The contrast between the cold, methodical demeanor of the killers and the frantic, desperate screaming of the young girl was profoundly unnatural. The investigator sat completely paralyzed, listening to the literal sound of a human life being systematically extinguished. it became blindingly obvious that this audio tape was the most definitive, damning piece of evidence in criminal history.
The high-profile trial of Lawrence Bittaker commenced in a heavily secured courtroom, drawing immense media attention from across the entire United States. The prosecution knew that to secure the ultimate punishment, they needed to demonstrate the absolute, unmitigated depravity of the crimes committed. The decision was made to play the infamous audio recording aloud for the jury, a move that sent a wave of tense anticipation through the gallery. Before pressing play, the judge solemnly warned the public, explicitly advising anyone with a weak heart or sensitive disposition to exit the courtroom immediately. The main doors were locked shut, the lights were dimmed, and the prosecutor pressed the heavy button on the tape player. As the horrific, piercing screams of Shirley Ledford flooded the courtroom, an oppressive, suffocating blanket of pure horror settled over the entire audience. The psychological impact of the audio tape on the courtroom was instantaneous, devastating, and entirely unprecedented in modern legal history. Members of the jury openly wept, shielding their faces, while others stared ahead in a state of absolute catatonic shock. Hardened journalists who had covered brutal murders for decades dropped their pens, completely unable to process the sheer malice emanating from the speakers. Even the courtroom sketch artists stopped drawing, paralyzed by the raw, auditory reality of human suffering filling the space. Lawrence Bittaker, however, sat at the defense table with a completely blank, completely emotionless expression, showing absolutely no remorse for his actions. The tape ran for several agonizing minutes before the judge ordered it stopped, the echoing screams lingering in the quiet air like a physical entity. The trial was effectively over. The tape had sealed the killer's fates beyond any shadow of a doubt.
The jury deliberated for a remarkably short period before returning with a unanimous verdict of guilty on all counts, sentencing Bittaker to death. Roy Norris, having cooperated with the prosecution to escape execution, was sentenced to life in prison, where he would eventually die behind bars. Lawrence Bittaker spent decades on California's death row, maintaining his eerie, cold demeanor until his natural death in prison in late 2019. The silver GMC van was destroyed, and the terrifying craftsman's toolbox was locked away forever in a secure police evidence vault. Yet, the true legacy of the Toolbox Killers lives on in the permanent psychological scars borne by everyone who heard that tape. The FBI still utilizes the horrific audio recording in behavioral science training today, educating agents on the absolute darkest depths of human depravity. It remains a stark, terrifying reminder that sometimes the most profound monsters drive ordinary vans and carry ordinary tools.